Welcome back, everyone, to learning what the word intent means. With me, your host, the Wise Hoopo. Today, we're covering the bracket system. Not just defining it, but learning what it means, why we got to it, and how it should affect your deck building for maximum fun. Still, to start, we need to define what the bracket system is if we're going to discuss its pros and cons. Even if you do know it, this part is a good scene setter for the rest of the video as it shows how I conceptualize it. The bracket system is a set of design guidelines for deck building that can help people find games that better match their intended experience. It does this by, first, outlining 5 intended styles of gameplay that people tend to gravitate towards in Commander, and then outlining deck building guidelines to help players understand what those gameplay styles feel like. To help with those guidelines, they established a list of cards called Game Changers that tend to, for a variety of different reasons, cause the dynamics of the table to shift. Often, when they are played, they either create overwhelming advantage or cause players to shut down and create a negative gameplay pattern. I want to say at the top, I like this system of essentially setting the vibe and then telling people not to ruin it. I also think the concept of Game Changers as cards that by themselves ruin that vibe is a great thing to give to the community at large. It's not a surprise that I like this warning sign style of community management. It helps level the playing field between newer and older players and their knowledge of gameplay experience. Additionally, I know it is common advice that this system isn't for you if you have a regular playgroup, that it's just for randos. I understand where this is coming from, and I also think it's doing a lot more harm than good. If I have a mismatched game with a stranger, I can walk away and move along with my life. However, if I seem to not be able to match my gameplay expectations with my friend Don, that is going to weigh on every game that night with him, and possibly our greater friendship. Because of this, I think learning how to use the bracket system and its associated communication tools is even more important for those with a regular playgroup, not less. This all exists to solve a problem as old as the format itself. How do you get 4 people to agree on what casual magic means? Not only before they play together, but before they even know each other exist, when they're putting cards into their decks. Before the brackets, we had generally 2 approaches to solve this. First was a more rigid approach that involved massive ban lists and rigid deck building guidelines. The problem that arises when you try to use this approach is that centering deck restrictions invites people to try and circumvent those restrictions. Very malicious compliance type beat. It also declares that only a certain kind and strength of gameplay is valid in a given space, creating an endless game of whack-a-mole between those who need to be regulated and those trying to regulate them. I have even seen people turn this into a game where players try to get cards banned on purpose. You see the remnants of this fight when you get to the technically it's a 1 crowd in the bracket system today. The other method was the often maligned system of 1 through 10 power levels. The problems here were numerous, but I think the biggest downfalls come from tying it to gameplay outcomes and how well built a person's deck was. The first one runs into the problem of requiring a player to play or goldfish their deck enough to have intimate knowledge of a variety of thresholds of gameplay, as well as enough game knowledge to understand how their decks are performing, even in pods where they're losing. This basically gatekept the system to well-enfranchised players from Jump Street. Next, by making the different levels about how competent your deck functioned, it creates a hierarchy of value. This creates a thought process of evaluating value that, we can see from games and movies, makes it so no one actually scores the thing below a 5. Pair this with cordoning off 9 and 10 for CDH, and you end up with everyone really only choosing 6, 7, or 8. With 6 being the deck you're willing to play with precons, 8 being a pub-stomping high-power deck, and 7 basically everything else. This gradually congeals into the every deck is a 7 meme of the era. It's pretty easy to see that brackets borrowed elements from both of these approaches. However, the main thing they do to help with these failing methods is less a direct change and more a pivot in perspective. This is the focus on intended experience. It gets everyone to acknowledge that how you build your deck and how it plays are linked, not just in levels of optimization, but in the kinds of games that those decks create. This allows them to take things like the feel bads of extending a ban list and instead try and address it with a softer touch, Game Changers, while acknowledging that those players are valid and simply deserve their own well-defined place to play. Additionally, by describing each bracket as optimizing for a different but equally valid form of play, they eliminate the value hierarchy that power levels created. Finally, brackets' best quality is not even pretending to be comprehensive in their deck building guidelines. By doing this, they invite players to be self-reflective about what kind of fun they want to have and how they create that experience themselves. Alright, so I probably titled this something along the lines of "We're using the bracket system wrong." But we're well into the video and I haven't acknowledged any possible flaws. It's not going to be some small quibble about game changers should say this or brackets should specify that. While those are fine conversations to have, I find them pedantic in the face of a bigger problem. While I was writing this video, I saw this graph of hypothetical distribution of decks within the bracket system. I find this graph to be likely accurate and emblematic of the problem going on here, because those here and those here are likely going to have a bad time if they play against each other. The same is true for the more distant parts of each of the other brackets. So the obvious solution posed in the article this is from is to make the brackets smaller. But yet I think this is missing the forest for the trees. The actual problem here is that this is a random distribution. For those who aren't versed in statistics, that means that this is what would happen if we just built a bunch of decks and then mapped the bracket system onto them after the fact. This is kind of an issue for a system I just praised for having a core feature being acknowledging how you build your deck and modifying it to fit the specific bracket you want to be in. To outline what I'm talking about, if we assumed people were building with the system in mind, in the optimal way, we'd assume this distribution would be closer to this. See how this minimizes those problematic fringes on each of the brackets. Now, there's still a world, if we get this distribution, that one of the brackets is still so large that we see the same problems even at higher parts of the curve. At which point, splitting the bracket is totally on the table. But until deck building habits start to form around this distribution, I think we're going to just divide the format until we end up with a less pretentious sounding power levels again. Now, this comes with the assumption that this initial random distribution is correct. And to back that assertion, I want to refer to several common archetypes of online criticism, and I will show how these actually stem from not using the bracket system as it is intended to be used. First is the 3 cards don't change a deck crowd. This is a critique leveled at game changers as a misunderstanding of where power in a deck comes from. This line of thought about the system seems to treat the restrictions as a comprehensive guideline to fit the outlined vibe, which it is not trying to be. Instead, this restriction is trying to pull attention to how these cards are played. They have a tendency to monopolize game's attention. If you include them in a deck that would otherwise fit into bracket 2, or too many of them in a deck meant for bracket 3, then these cards will bury the intended game experience you wanted, instead turning the game into a puzzle about them. I have a friend who's a good example of this. Let's call him Bikey. Bikey said he wanted to run Ristic Study to support an Alphanoid and Alcy deck. I warned of the problem I just outlined, but he insisted the rest of the deck was so bad that it made it balanced. Bikey figured out in 2 games where he played Study that it made his commanders entirely superfluous. He took it out shortly after. This is the purpose of game changers. Not that they themselves will raise the power of your deck, but that you should build your deck so that you can match the power of those game changers. Next is those who point out that a 5 game changer or 1 quick combo line can't compete with a fully optimized bracket 4 deck. This is a more sophisticated version of the previous complaint, understanding the purpose of game changers, but still pointing out our previous assertion that the fringes of each bracket are leagues apart. Usually describing the player that makes the 5 game changer list as being punished for stumbling into bracket 4 by accident. However, I found that if you're thinking of the brackets at the deck building stage, this becomes a strength, not a weakness, as it would ideally eliminate these stumbling into bracket 4 decks. In the previous system, the common outcome for this kind of deck was to have it so that it was incredibly inconsistent, randomly pub stomping or being incredibly mediocre depending on its draws. With the bracket system, the game changers list and combo callouts get to act as these caution signs to players, warning them that if they want to add that combo, they better fully commit to bracket 4 gameplay patterns, or else they're going to get stomped. This was actually one of my first positive experiences with brackets. My other friend, let's call him Jacob, has a Shorakai vehicles list, and he was struggling right before brackets came out. He was thinking of adding Dramatic Scepter combo as a way to close out games, in addition to his current Dragonfly suits and aerial mech hangers. I tried to warn him that if he would do this, it would create the situation where other players would have to kill him as soon as he played a Thran Dynamo, just in case he had the combo. Jacob did not understand until the brackets came out. and I could frame it as the combo putting him in bracket 4, where the rest of the deck did not have the ability to compete. This also had the knock-on effect of allowing bracket 3 to be his shortcut, telling everyone else at the game store, hey, don't worry, no combo here. This allowed him to focus on keeping his deck's power level consistent, but also notice how this way of using these warning signs guides players. Instead of slowly sliding up the power scale, creating the previously problematic random distribution, this incentivizes jumping from where you are to the middle of the next bracket every time you want to increase. The final group I want to address is those who, like me, clamored for a turn count to be added to better clarify the brackets. In retrospect, the process of learning what turn a deck wins is often far more enlightening to its intended bracket than the number itself. This change has not only caused weird wrinkles around Voltron, aggro, and control decks, but also has been used as an overly rigid guideline, causing people to run to the edges of the brackets, not the middle where we want them. Honestly, I think the actual thing this restriction is trying to gesture to is not quite win speed, but more expected interaction level. If I were to offer one change to the current brackets, it would be to switch expected turns of play to what speed of removal is needed to stop your deck. At bracket 2, sorcery speed answers to onboard threats should work fine. Bracket 3, now we're running infinites. You are expected to have an instant speed answer. And finally, bracket 4, we are expecting you to have an answer at any time, even if your mana isn't untapped. This maps better onto the other guidelines on win conditions, while continuing the strong focus on how you are expected to play being a part of the deck building process. All that aside, what do I think will bring us to this more ideal distribution that I keep talking about? Well, to no one's surprise, I think it comes from critically evaluating what you want your deck to be and pruning it until it conforms to that ideal. To give some more actionable tips though, try to make sure that your most powerful cards in your deck are part of your game plan, and not just the game changers supporting the deck. Additionally, engage in regular discussions with your playgroups about what games you're having fun and what games are feeling a bit off. Feel free to use the language of brackets and game changers to try and dial in that pod balance. Finally, be willing to understand that you might be the problem and dial your stuff back, or better point out your flaws to your opponents in your pregame talks. For a helpful metric, your win percentage over 25 plus games with a single deck should equalize between 10 and 40%. A 15% swing in win percentage is the level of advantage managed by the best CDH grinders in the format. Anything beyond that, it's likely not personal skill, it's more likely dwelling into a realm of pod imbalance. I hope this video contributed to your understanding of brackets more than just the normal summary video. If it did, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed or shared this video to help you and your friends get on the same page with this stuff. I found it can be quite frustrating to force power regulations on people unwillingly. So let me be the impartial third party. If you want to hear my more particular opinions on anything I talk about in these videos, come join the Discord, where I can review your decks while I'm bored at work. Or follow me on the social medias I am trying to get better at using, I promise. Finally, please comment about how you try to modify your decks to fit in specific brackets. I personally like to make my aggro decks really easy to thwart and vulnerable to board wipes in bracket 2. Finally, thank you all for watching. Keeping this 2-week schedule is a little hard during the holidays, but we're getting there. I've actually decided the next video, if you want, you can comment on whether or not you want to see another retrospective idea on like card arts and my opinions on proxies as they've gone through, or on like gameplay and tempo and how you manipulate that and use it to win. Yeah, comment down below and have a happy holidays.